We're about to start. All right. I think you made Daniel the host. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, make the other me the host or co-host.
Oh, sorry, Clyde. My microphone was cut off. How do I do that?
Oh, no, we got it. We got it. It was good.
Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our final session of What History Class Left Out, African History Part 1, African History from 10,000 BCE to 711 CE. And that's where we're going to conclude our class today. We will pick up with Part 2 of this class. Actually, it doesn't come right after this class. We pick up with Part 2 of this class in February during Black History Month. And in between, we have we'll have 3 exciting courses in between Part 1 of this course and Part 2 of this course. Next week, we will start our September seminar. So we'll have 4 weeks in September dedicated to studying the life and contributions of Paul Robeson. I'll talk more about that at the conclusion of this class. Starting in October, between October and November, we will have our Sheroes course, where we look at African women as leaders of resistance movements and fighters against oppression and freedom fighters between October and November. So that class, 8 weeks, complete focus on African women as resistance leaders. Then in December and January, we will have another seminar dedicated to study or honoring the 220th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution and Haitian independence. So we'll be talking about Haiti in December and January. So tell everybody you know to join in all of those courses before we get to Part 2 of this course starting in February. That'll take us from 711 to 1896. So we're going to wrap up today as usual. I'll lecture for about 20 minutes. We'll have a Q&A in the middle, and then I'll lecture again, myself as well as Daniel, and then we will open it up for Q&A. I do have to apologize. Last week, we had a technical glitch. We were trying to turn off the recording session to open up our open Q&A, and we accidentally shut off the entire thing. So my apologies to anyone that had a question or a comment at the end of last session. That was unintentional. We hit the wrong button, so we will make sure that today we'll stay open and we'll have any last comments, questions, or concerns in our open Q&A at the end. So let's get right into it. This week we are talking about Arab expansion into Africa and African resistance to that expansion around the 700s and into the 800s CE. This is also during the time of the rise of Islam as one of the world's great monotheistic religions. And we'll talk about how that coincides with Arab expansion into North Africa and Northwest Africa. When we talk about Islam and Arabs, we got to be clear. Arabic is an ethnic group, it's a language, it's a people. Islam is a religion. So we have many Africans today that are Muslim, that practice Islam, but they're not Arab. And you got, most Arabs are Muslim today, but we have to make that distinction because sometimes people talk about the Islamic invasion in Africa. And although the Arabs were united by Islam, we're going to see today that it really wasn't a religious movement. It was more of an empire building that happened to be done by people that were Muslims. And as we'll talk about today, they really didn't even want people to convert right away to Islam. But we'll talk about that. But I always got to make that distinction. Also, when we talk about North Africa, and I've mentioned this in past before, well, you're going to see today how that whole question of Arab, African, Amazigh identity gets confused in this area. Not confused, but gets muddled in this area. Where sometimes when we talk about North Africa, we talk about Islamic Africa, we talk about Arabic Africa, but really that's not 100% the case, because you have the Amazigh people who are called Berbers, who are Muslim, but they're not Arab, and oftentimes they get confused for Arab. So we'll talk about all those distinctions today as well. But we're going to pick up a little bit, and just to kind of visualize this, what we're talking about, what this class has covered. This class has covered 5,000 years before, actually closer to 7,000 years before this timeline starts. But recorded history begins right around 3000 BCE when we talked about the unification of Egypt and writing becoming a thing. We've gone all the way from there up to past the midpoint, up to right where you see the Moors at 711. We will stop at 711 CE. So this is the entire time period that we covered. And then part 2 of our class will take us up to 1896. So we're going right up to 711 CE, or Common Era, today. We'll talk about the Moors. Again, just a reminder, evidence. All the historical claims and the stories that we talk about and the narratives that we recount all are based in historical evidence. And that evidence is coming to us from archaeology, it's coming to us from Greek written sources, Ge'ez written sources. So this is coming out of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Latin, Arabic, and Coptic. So all of these written sources represent the primary materials that we're basing this history on. And then, of course, we can look at the archaeological record as well to verify a lot of this, as well as the numismatic, the study of coins and that type of thing, which we talked about last week. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off with last week. Last week, we talked about Nubia, talked about Christian Nubia, we talked about Christian Aksum, the rise of Aksum, where the young man present about Nubia, and we'll go back to that discussion in a little bit more depth today. But Aksum, because this connects right into the emergence of Islam. And you have to understand the dynamics in this region to understand how Islam emerged, and then how the Arab empire that was unified Islam emerged not long after that. So around 520 CE, we have a great king in Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea. That king's name was Caleb. Caleb is one of the few people that has been canonized in both the Coptic Church as well as the Catholic Church. And we talked last week about the difference that emerged between the church in Rome, what is now the Catholic Church, as well as the churches in Africa and the churches in Asia. The church in Africa, based in the Coptic church in Egypt, adopted a Miaphysite version of Christology, meaning they're Christians, but in these particular churches, they stress the divinity of Christ more so than his manhood. You talk about what Christ was, and then those debates around Christology. Was he half man, half God, all God, a little bit of man, all those types of things? Well, the Miaphysite church focused on the divinity of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth, more so than his humanness. And that caused a division with the Roman church. So the Egyptians, the Nubians, as well as the Aksumites, or the folks in Ethiopia, they adopted that version of Christianity, that Christology. And because of that, they don't have the same saints. A lot of the early saints, Peter and James and Mark, they share those. But as people get canonized later on, you start to see a division. There's Catholic saints that aren't recognized by the Coptic Church, and there's Coptic saints that aren't recognized by the church in Rome. King Caleb is one of the few that's recognized by both because of his story. So what happens? At this point, as we talked about last week, Aksum was a major trading power in the Red Sea going into the Indian Ocean area, this part of the Horn of Africa. And oftentimes they controlled southern Yemen, or the kingdom of Saba. Well, at some point, Aksum lost control of that region, and the kingdom of Himyar emerged. And at one point, Himyar had a Jewish king. The guy, he converted to Judaism, and he was the king in this southern Himyar kingdom. When he becomes king, he starts to persecute the Christians in his kingdom. He starts killing them and doing all types of things to them. And the Christians reach out to two rulers. One, they reach out to the emperor of Rome, the Roman emperor. And Rome at this time is based pretty much in what's now Turkey, in the city of Byzantine, Constantinople. So this is the Byzantine Empire, is what historians call it. But it's really the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire is incredibly weak at this point. It's really just the city of Rome, what they call the Vandals and the Visigoths and all these different nations and tribes in Western Europe have pretty much weakened the Roman Empire in the West. So we're talking about the Roman Empire in France and Britain and in Germany and Italy and Spain. That part of the empire is weak. But the eastern part of the Roman Empire, that's based in Constantinople, that's based in the Byzantine region, and it's also Greek-speaking, they're still a dominant force, and they really represent the continuation of the Roman Empire. So the Christians in southern Yemen, they reach out to the Roman emperor, and they also reach out to the emperor of Aksum, the Negus. That means king, the emperor, the king of kings, Caleb. The Byzantine ruler corresponds with Caleb. And Caleb takes it upon himself, because remember, even though they practice different types of Christianity, they have different Christologies, they're still brothers in the faith. So Caleb amasses an army from Aksum, crosses the Red Sea, and attacks the kingdom of Himyar and conquers it. And liberates and frees those Christians that are under persecution from this evil king. So when he does this, and it's really important what's going on when we zoom out this time period, you can see in green, this is the Roman Empire. This is the Byzantine Empire. This is what's controlling Egypt at this time, the coast of North Africa, all of modern-day Turkey going into Syria. And at the same time, you also have a emergent Persian Empire, the Neo-Persian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire. This is a regrouped Persian Empire that's also another player in the region. So you got three big players. You got Aksum, you got Rome, and you got the Persians. So remember those three, Aksum, Rome, and the Persians, all vying for power in this region. And the Arabs, nobody is really concerned about the Arabs at this point. So we're talking about the 500s, 500 CE. The Arabs they're not united. They're fighting amongst themselves. Islam has not come into the picture yet. And they're just clans that are really good at fighting, but they're fighting themselves over control over oases in the Arab Peninsula, because, this is mostly desert. So if you can control the places with water, the places that are fertile, then you have power. So the Arabs are fighting amongst themselves, and you have three major kingdoms surrounding them: the Persians, the Romans, and the Aksumites. So, like I've said, Emperor Justin reaches out, and that says Azana, but it shouldn't say, it should say Negus Caleb. He reaches out to Caleb, and Caleb goes and invades and conquers. Because of this, because he saved the Christians in this region, like I said, he's canonized by both the Catholic Church as well as the Coptic Church. One of the few people in history that actually is canonized by both churches. Very important. Also, and he's canonized as Saint Elisabon, because one of his names was also, I can't remember how it's pronounced, and I think it's El Saba, or something like that in Giz. But he's canonized as Saint Elisabon. So you might see that name. So if you're a youth and you're taking this class and you're in the Ottawa Catholic School Board and you got to write a paper on a saint, why not pick an African saint? There's a lot of them, Saint Benedict the Moor, so many others. But anyway, after he does this and he rules, he's such a devout Christian that he actually decides toward the end of his reign to give up his throne and become a monk and live in a monastery. So he actually renounces the throne and becomes a monk and spends the rest of his life in religious study and promoting Christianity and that type of thing. So it's another reason why he was canonized, because he didn't want to be a worldly king anymore. When he does this, after he abdicates his throne and goes to religious life, the kingdom of Himyar that he's taken over, he leaves somebody in charge. And they're, doing things and they're sending money back to the kingdom of Aksum. But eventually, some of those soldiers that had gone over to do the fighting, they don't like the viceroy or the representative of the king that's in charge, and they actually overthrow him. And this is led by a general named General Abraha. So General Abraha takes over the kingdom of Himyar in southern Arabia, and he's an Ethiopian as well. Some biographies of him have him as a former Roman slave that gets involved in the Ethiopian army. So he's Ethiopian. He was enslaved by one of the Roman noblemen, gets his freedom, becomes part of the military, rises up, becomes a general, and he's incredibly ambitious, so he has a military coup. So military coups in Africa aren't new things. They go back a long ways. He takes over in southern Arabia, in Yemen. And when he becomes king, he's also a Christian, but he wants to build a grand cathedral in his new capital city of Sana'a. You can kind of see it there in southern Yemen. The kingdom's going to be moved to this capital of Sana'a. In Sana'a, he wants to build a magnificent cathedral that folks from all over the region will come, they'll pray, and most importantly, they'll spend money. Because if you're coming to the cathedral, that means you got to go and you got to pay taxes, you got to, shop at the shops, and the king gets a cut of those taxes. The church is going to get offerings. The church probably will kick up something to the king. It's a money maker. So if you build a grand cathedral, you get pilgrims to come to the cathedral, and they'll spend money, you'll make money, and grow rich. The problem is, in Arabia already, there is a place that pilgrims already go, and it's in Mecca, and it's the Kaaba. Now, this is about 100 years before the birth of, a couple of years, maybe 5 years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad that this is starting. So Islam hasn't come yet. But however, the Kaaba, this shrine in Mecca, had been a pilgrimage site for generations. People had come, pagans had come and worshiped at the Kaaba. In fact, it's one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad does. He cleanses the Kaaba of all the pagan idols and things that people had put up on this monument, on this temple. Now the Muslims say it was built by Abraham and his son Ishmael. The pagans say that it came from somewhere else. But anyway, it had been a holy site for generations. And people had come to make pilgrimage at the Kaaba well before Islam even emerges. Because of this, the king in Himyar, King Araba, decides that he is going to tear down the Kaaba because it's competition for the new cathedral that he's going to build. So he sets off from Sana'a with 13 war elephants and a number of troops, all with the desire to destroy the Kaaba, to divert those pilgrims and their money to his new cathedral in Sana'a. This happens in 570 CE. And in the Quran, this is known as the year of the elephant, because these elephants were coming to destroy the Kaaba. So King Araba comes 570, ready to destroy the Kaaba, and then according to the Quran, these elephants come and they get to the gates of Mecca, and all of a sudden, Allah sends these birds out of the heavens, and these birds come and they have rocks, and they pelt the elephants with rocks, and the elephants get so startled that they turn their course and they charge back into the troops that brought them, and it's a failed attempt to conquer Mecca and destroy the Kaaba. So the Kaaba is saved. And this is incredibly significant because the year that this happens, the year that Allah spares the Kaaba, spares Mecca from this invasion from this Ethiopian general that's now made himself king in southern Yemen, it's the same year that the Prophet Muhammad is born. He is born in the year of the elephant. So it's incredibly influential year when we talk about the history of Islam, and Africa plays a major role in this. So this happens. The Prophet Muhammad is born, and the Prophet Muhammad is in this disunited Arab world, where you have all the Arab clans fighting amongst each other, fighting for control of trade routes, and these trade routes, again, are connecting them to Palestine and other parts of Western Asia. It's connecting them to Africa. So it's really important who's going to control this region. And this is the type of world that the Prophet Muhammad comes up in. It's a world that's becoming incredibly more interconnected. We've talked about this in past week. The camel has made its way into Africa. Trade is going from West Africa all the way to East Africa. We have the Swahili city-states that we talked about. We talked about the Bantu migration. We got the Roman Empire. We have the Persian Empire. You have the empire in China. You have kingdoms in India. The world is becoming incredibly connected. And Arabs are taking advantage of this by becoming traders. The Prophet Muhammad was a trader. He was a businessman. So there's a lot of money to be made. A lot of interconnections are happening. A lot of ideas are being shared. In fact, in Arabia, you had a number of Jewish communities, like we already mentioned. The kingdom of Himyar was ruled by a Jewish man at one point. You had Christianity spreading in the region. So you had those two faiths. You had the pagan faiths of the Arabs, and then the Prophet Muhammad comes after his revelation with Islam. A relatively simple religion. All it's saying is there's one God. There's no God but Allah. You know, there's not a whole lot of elaborate rituals. Just you have to fast at Ramadan. You have to pray, 5 times a day, that type of thing. It was a unifying force among the Arabs. But it wasn't readily accepted. The Arabs didn't open their arms wide when they heard the Prophet's revelation. In fact, he was persecuted. So the early followers of the Prophet Muhammad were actually driven out of Mecca, and the Prophet had to flee to Medina. When the Prophet flees to Medina, some of his followers break off and are sent to seek refuge across the Red Sea in the kingdom of Aksum. So from the very beginnings of Islam, the kingdom of Aksum plays a key role in the narrative. From the time of the Prophet Muhammad's birth to when the Prophet Muhammad's followers are seeking refuge, they get it in the kingdom of Aksum. And because of that, the Prophet Muhammad would often talk about the piety and the holiness of Ethiopians, and that they helped, help the faith in its time of great peril. So that's really important to point out. When religious figures are in trouble, they run to Africa. When Jesus was about to be killed as a young child by Herod, where did his family go? They into Egypt. When the followers of the Prophet Muhammad were driven out of Mecca, needed a place to go, where did they go? The kingdom of Aksum. They went to Africa. So Africa plays a key role in these things. Oftentimes that's forgotten by a lot of the followers of this religion. They like to castigate Africans, enslave Africans, that type. We'll get into that later. But anyway, all of this happens, and eventually the Prophet Muhammad is able to spread his message, get more converts, more people convert to Islam, and eventually by the time of his death, the Arabs have united under this faith. And with this unification, under the leadership of first Muhammad and then later on the successors of Muhammad, the Arabs are saying, well, we're united, we know how to fight, we've been fighting each other, but now we don't need to fight each other anymore. Why don't we expand? Why don't we build an empire? We'll come out of Arabia, we will take advantage of all this interconnections that's happening in the world, and we will expand. And if people happen to convert to Islam along the way, that's good too. But at first, the expansion wasn't about converting people to Islam. It was about building an empire. So Muhammad unifies everything you see in the dark orange, almost red color during the time of the Prophet Muhammad's life until his death in 632. And these years are kind of important. So remember the years. So this happened in 632. The Prophet Muhammad dies. Everything you see in red has been united, including southern Yemen. So that region that used to be controlled by Aksum is now a part of the Arab Empire. So there's still Christians there, there's still Jews there, and little by little there's people that are non-believers, but they'll eventually convert. What this emerging Arab Empire is coming into is a larger world that has been weakened by the fights between the Persians and the Romans, which really is a fight that goes a long way back, because these Romans are mostly Greek-speaking, and the fights between the Greek-speaking world and Persia go all the way back, even prior to Alexander. So that's 300 BCE. So this is almost at this point, we're getting close to 1,000 years of fighting between Greek-speaking people and Persian-speaking people. But now we got the Greek-speaking Romans and the Persians that have been fighting each other in this region. The Persian Empire emerged around, the new Persian Empire emerged around 300, gets to its height at around 500, right around the time of the year, the elephant and all that. And they're battling the Romans over control of the region. So while those two bulls are fighting each other, neither one of them is paying attention to these new unified Arabs. So because of that, this Arab empire is able to spread incredibly quickly into Western Asia to control Palestine, to control Syria, making its way all the way over through Iran. It basically takes over the Persian Empire. People convert to Islam, and you have the makings of this new player in the region, this Arab empire. Now, like I said, at the beginnings of this empire, as the army is capturing territory, they're not necessarily interested in people converting to Islam. They make people pay a poll tax. They make people pay a tax that basically says, if you want to, you can convert to Islam, you can pay the tax to continue to practice whatever religion that it is, but you got to pay money, or you can die. These are the options. Pay the tax, convert, or die. So at the beginnings, most people just paid the tax. They paid the tax. It's not until a couple of years later that people are like, you know what, I'll just convert to Islam. This seems to be the winning religion right now. This is how a lot of religions spread. This seems to be the winning religion, so I'm just going to convert. At least I'll do so in name, and I won't have to pay the poll tax. But that takes a minute. So a lot of these places, you have Zoroastrians, you have Christians, you have Jews, you have people that practice all types of different things, and the Muslims are taxing them, lining their pockets, getting money for their war chests, so that way you can buy more soldiers, you can get more weapons, and you can continue their expansion. So this happens very fast. Again, Muhammad dies in 632. They conquer the Western Asia by the 650s, 20 years later. Very quick spread. Then they turn their attention west, and they start looking at Egypt. Egypt has always been the crown jewel in any emerging empire in this region, going all the way back. We go back to the original Persian Empire. They conquered Egypt. The Assyrians conquered Egypt. The Greeks under Alexander of Macedon conquered Egypt. The Romans under Caesar and Augustus conquered Egypt. So Egypt has always been this valuable jewel. Everybody wants to conquer Egypt. It's the ancient civilization. And then most importantly, Egypt has always been rich in agriculture. That's what made the pharaohs wealthy and made Egypt prosperous back in the day. Same thing. Egypt was still producing grain. Egypt was still a breadbasket of this region of the ancient world. So the Arabs wanted to take over Egypt, the same way they did Persia, the same way they did Syria and these other places. Egypt was under control of the Romans. They were going to have to fight it out. The Romans had a problem, though. Because of that difference, we go back, what I talked about last week and what I talked about at the beginning of this class. The difference in Christology had created a split between the Romans that ruled Egypt and the people that lived there. The people that lived in Egypt, the masses of Egyptians, they had stayed loyal to the Coptic church. They had their own pope, the Pope of the Coptic Church. It was based in Alexandria. And their Miaphysite Christianity that focused more on the divinity of Christ. That was the faith of the masses of people in Egypt. And because of that, the Roman administrators who were connected to the church in Rome, the Catholic Church, they burdened these people with taxes. They oppressed these people because of their faith. They wanted them to convert to the Catholic version of Christianity, and the people refused. So they were taxed. There was a lot of corruption going on among the Roman administrators. So the people weren't really invested in supporting Rome. So when the Arabs show up, the Egyptian masses, they're not going to fight. They're like, go ahead, take it over. You can't be worse than the Romans. So they thought. You can't be worse than the Romans. So the Arabs take over Egypt relatively quickly. They moved the capital from Alexandria to a new city that they built called Cairo, which is still the capital of modern Egypt today. And they have to contend with a Roman navy that's still operating in the Mediterranean. The Arabs don't really have a navy at this point. They'll eventually build one, but they don't have a navy. They're used to fighting, cavalry and using horses and camels and fighting ground battles, and they're really good at it, but they don't have a navy. The Romans, they lose Egypt, but they still have other parts of Northwest Africa that they control. So the Romans retreat from Egypt. They fortify their navy to protect the major cities on the coast, including Carthage that they rebuilt after, we talked about the Roman fight against Hannibal and the Barcids and fighting, and then they destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic War. Well, they had rebuilt Carthage, but as a Roman city. And we talked about the Donatists and the Christians that came out of there. So there's a lot of stuff going on the coast of North Africa that the Arabs are going to have to contend with. And then, as always, like we talked about, when rulers attempt to take over parts of Northeast Africa, soon as they capture Egypt, they immediately turn their sights south because they realize that Egypt is rich in agriculture and can feed people. But the real prize is Nubia. Nubia has the gold, Nubia has iron, Nubia has frankincense and myrrh, Nubia has animal skins, Nubia has wood, at least they're starting to run out at this point, but Nubia has a lot of the richness. So the Arabs decide, let's go try to take Nubia. The same way that the Romans decided they were going to try to attempt to take Nubia, it usually doesn't end well. And we kind of alluded to this last week when Abdallah presented, but we're going to talk more in depth about it after we come back from our next break. We're going to talk about what happened when the Arabs attempted to conquer Nubia. It didn't go well for them. All right, so we'll take a break, open up to Q&A, and then we'll get back into it. So, Daniel, any questions in the chat or are there any hands?
I don't see any questions in the chat right now.
Okay. Anybody have a question? Any hands? If not, we get right into it. All right. Going once, going twice. Okay, I don't see anything. So, Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about Nubia's reaction to this Arab invasion.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So last week we talked about the Christian kingdoms of Awa, Makuria, and Nobatia. And we briefly mentioned the campaigns that the Nubians and the Arabs fought against each other, but we didn't really spend too much time about that. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And so the Nubian-Arab wars are known as the First and Second Battles of Dongola. And before we get into that, it's important to talk about the reputation that Nubians had historically. And so Eurasian writers have frequently referred to the people of Nubia as excellent archers. For example, Herodotus, one of the greatest Greco-Roman historians, wrote that the Ethiopians tied leopard skins and lion pelts around themselves and were armed with bows made from the spines of palm tree fronds. These bows were immense, 4 cubits long and at least, while the arrows were short, and tipped not with iron but with sharpened pieces of the kind of stone they use in the engraving of signet rings. And so we have lots of Greco-Roman writers who talk about Nubian archers, and then we also have Arab and European writers who talk about Africans outside of Nubia who were fierce archers. So that context is very important before we get into the battles of Dongola.
And Daniel, before you go further, I just want to explain something to people so they can kind of get that quote. When an ancient source mentions a cubit as a measurement, a cubit is typically measured from the size of an average man's elbow to the top of his middle finger. So it's a little bit longer than a foot. So when Herodotus is saying that they were holding 4 bows that were 4 cubits long, these are long bows, incredibly long bows, almost over 4-foot bows. The strength that it takes to number one, string that, to get enough tension to shoot, makes you incredibly powerful. So don't let that, it might sound like a little thing, oh, it's 4 cubits, what does that mean? These are huge bows that these folks are using in their warfare, which goes to show you how powerful these people were. I just wanted to point that out, Daniel. Sorry for interrupting.
No, all good. Thank you for that context. I didn't know how long a cubit was either. Okay, so to get into the first battle of Dongola, last week we mentioned a writer named al-Baladuri. And so we know from the Arab sources that there was an Arab general named Ibn al-Asi who conquered Egypt in the 7th century and introduced Islam into Africa. And so we know from al-Baladuri that after he took over Egypt, he sent his brother al-Fihri to conquer all of the countries around Egypt and sent soldiers into Nubia. And we know from his account that the Nubians decimated the Arabs when they tried to conquer their country. And according to al-Baladuri, the Arabs were, quote, subjected to severe showers of arrows until most of them were wounded and had to return with many wounds and blinded eyes. Therefore were the Nubians called the archers of the eyes. Other translations say they were called pupil smiters. And so he says that after this campaign, the Nubians would continue to destroy the Arabs until al-Asi was replaced by General Abdullah as the governor of Egypt. And so at that point, the Nubians asked for peace, and the Arabs allegedly granted that peace. And we'll talk about that more on the next slide. And al-Makrizi, one of our Arab authorities, says that General Abdallah went to Nubia with an army of 20,000 soldiers in the year 20 or 21 AH, or after Hijra, which would correspond to 641 or 642 CE. And so the result of this expedition into Nubia was the signing of the Bat Treaty, which was very, sorry, I'm trying to get my words together. This was a peace treaty that would keep the terms and stipulations for how Nubia and Arabia would conduct themselves towards one another. And this treaty was very special because it lasted over 600 years, which is abnormally long for any country to keep peace with another country. And so we have the terms and conditions of the treaty, and al-Baladuri says that when this treaty was signed, the General Abdallah set the terms that the Arabs pay no tax, but offer as a present 300 slaves per annum, and that the Muslims offer them as a present food equivalent to the value of the slaves. Al-Makrizi also says that the Nubians eventually broke the peace treaty, and General Abdullah had to launch a second campaign against them. And so Al-Makrizi says that their king, by the name of Kalidurut, asked for peace and went out to meet with Abdullah looking humble, sad, and submissive. Abdallah met him, raised him, and gave him a place near him. Then he concluded that the peace agreement with him on condition that he paid 360 men per year, while Abdullah undertook to supply him with grain, as the king had complained of the scarcity of the food in his country. And so right here we have to take what the Arabs are saying with a grain of salt, because if the Nubians lost the battle, then it wouldn't make sense for them to be dictating the terms of, we want to sign a peace treaty. So right here, this takes a little bit of nuance. We can get from the Arabs a sense of nationalist propaganda, so to speak. So it's always good to have that context in mind as we look at the primary sources. So now we get to the second battle of Dongola after the Nubians allegedly broke the peace treaty and out Egypt. He says that when Nubia broke the peace treaty, the ruler of Egypt noticed that the raids from Nubia in their country multiplied. And so, in consequence, General Abdullah, quote, raided the town of Dongola and shelled them in by means of catapults, which were unknown to Nubia. He broke down the roof of the church with stones from the catapults, and this astonished them. And this happened in the year 31 AH or 652 CE. And then after here, we see again that their king Kaliduru asked for peace and wanted to sign the peace treaty. So right here during the second battle, the pact wasn't signed, but it was reinforced. And now we're going to look at a transcription of what that peace treaty would have said. And so it says, omitting the conventional greetings, this is the convention given by the Emir Abdallah B. Said B. Abi Sar to the chief of the Nuba and to all the people of his kingdom, a convention binding all the Nubians, great and small, from the boundary line of Aswan to the frontier of Awa. Abdallah B. Said B. Abi Sar gave them security and truce, valid between them and the neighboring Muslims of Upper Egypt, as well as the other Muslims and the Dhimmi. You, Nubian people, will be safe under the guarantee of God and his prophet Muhammad, that we shall not fight you and shall not wage war upon you, nor shall we carry out raids on your country, as long as you keep the condition laid down between us and yourselves, that you enter our country in transit only, not for the purpose of settling there. We also shall enter your country in transit without settling there. You must protect any Muslim or anyone who is under our protection if he settles in your country or travels through it until he leaves the same. You must hand back any fugitive slave belonging to the Muslims who seeks shelter in your country. You must deliver him to the country of Islam. You must likewise return any Muslim who fights against the Muslims. You must drive him out of your country and deliver him to the country of Islam, without befriending him or without hindering him in any way. You must take care of the mosque which the Muslims have built in the enclosure of your town. You must not prevent anyone from praying there or interfere with any Muslim who goes there or lives close to it until he goes away. You must keep it swept and light it with lamps and respect it. You must give 360 men every year, whom you will hand over to the Imam of the Muslims, adults without bodily defects, both male and female. And so right here, we see an account of what the Arabs said in the treaty. Unfortunately, we don't have any Nubian documents talking about what they would have said and the terms that they agreed to. So for right now, we only have the Islamic perspective, but we don't have the African or the Christian perspective. And that's my presentation, and I'll hand it back over to you now.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. So that treaty, like Daniel mentioned, lasted for 600 years. And when we talk about those enslaved people, I want to be clear about that as well. A lot of those Africans that came from Nubia, that were enslaved, that ended up in the Arab world, went on to do great things. We'll actually talk about them in part two. But when it talks about both men and women, the majority of those enslaved people that went were actually women that were enslaved in sexual slavery. Now, people try to clean this up by talking about concubinage and people going into the great harems, because as these Arab rulers established themselves in Mesopotamia, what's now Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and ultimately Turkey and these other places, Syria, even going into Spain, they would have these large harems with women that would essentially just be kept as sex slaves. And a lot of the sisters that were enslaved in Nubia, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, that were taken into the slave trade in these Arab-controlled places were put into that position. One of the differences, though, between this Arab-initiated slavery and the slavery that we're going to see about 1,000 years later that emerges in the West is that the children of these unions would be born free. So if you were an enslaved African woman and you had a child with an Arab, your child would be free. And if that Arab was somebody of some prominence, they might themselves be given a prominent position and that type of thing. So we have that going on as well. Now, the men that went from Nubia, from Ethiopia, from Kenya, they would have to be placed in military service in one form or another. Either they were actually fighting as part of the army in places like Iraq and Syria, fighting for the folks that would eventually conquer Turkey, or fighting in these other regions, fighting in India, or they would be placed in charge of the harems as security, and they would often be castrated, and they would be made eunuchs. So a lot of eunuchs came out of Africa. These were men that were castrated, either the testicles and penis or just the testicles, and they would be placed in charge of these harems. Now, these men would later on become key players in the politics in the Islamic world as well. So it was really interesting phenomenon when we talk about that Eastern slave trade, which took more people out of Africa than what we would get 1,000 years later with the slave trade going to the Americas and into Western Europe. However, that trade was condensed to such in 400 years that it was more devastating to Africa. But more people actually left the Eastern way. It just happened over a longer period of time, so that the effects weren't as devastating to the kingdoms like the kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia and the kingdoms in along the Swahili city coast. But as still devastating to the people that went through it, of course, but not as devastating as what we would have 1,000 years later. Anyway, the Arabs would solidify their control over, after getting their butts kicked in Nubia, they would solidify their control over Egypt, but they wanted to go further west, into what they called the Maghreb, or the West. So all of these areas that were formerly under the control of the Romans. So this entire North African coast. As they're making their way west, they're coming in contact with, and let me go, because Daniel talked about this, they would come in contact with the remnants of the Romans that are making their way out of Africa as well. So you got the Romans that are there on the coast of North Africa, and then you have the general population. Again, a lot of them are Donatists. We talked about this last week. These are Christians that after the persecutions, when the Romans weren't Christian, they told people that if you renounce Christ, you can't come back to the church. So they had a little bit of a problem with the Catholic Church as well. So you have the Amazigh here, who are very similar to the Arabs. Very similar to the Arabs. These are the Africans that live in northern and northwest Africa. They're called the Berbers, but their actual name is Amazigh. And these people are indigenous to Africa. Now, they come in all shapes and colors. You know, you got some dark Berbers, you got light Berbers, which is often accounts for the confusion that people have between Berbers that have accepted Islam and Arabs. They're not one and the same thing, even though they might phenotypically look similar. They're not the same. So you have the Amazigh and you have Arabs. So when the Arabs are attempting to conquer North Africa, these are the folks that they're coming in contact with. So by the time we get to 700 CE, so again, Muhammad dies in 632. The Arabs have taken over what was the Persian Empire by the time we get to 650, and Egypt by the time we get to 650. So some 20 years later, 20 to 50 years later, they're attempting to make their way west, and they come across this woman, Dahiyya al-Kahina, or Dahiyya the sorceress, is what the Arabs call her. Al-Kahina means the sorceress, because they couldn't believe how much power this woman wielded among the Amazighs. They said she must be a sorceress. She must be a sorcerer. This woman united for a moment in time the Amazigh, who were like the Arabs. They weren't united either. You know, they lived in an area very similar to Arabia in that it was mostly desert. They were nomads. They knew how to migrate along the Sahara Desert. They were traders, just like the Arabs. So they would trade goods between West Africa and the northern coast of Africa going into Europe. They controlled all of that trade. They knew how to use camels for both transport and for military purposes, the same way the Arabs did. So when the Arabs make their way west and they get to this area that you see in purple, these are the folks that they're coming in contact with. And unlike the people in Egypt that didn't bother to fight because they were mad with the Romans, unlike the Persians that were weak from fighting the Romans, they were ready to fight the Arabs. They knew how to fight the same way the Arabs knew how to fight. So they met their match in North Africa. The only difference being they didn't have a unifying ideology the way the Arabs had. The Arabs had Islam. That was unifying them. The Berbers, you had some that were Christian. You had some that were Jews, and there's even some reports that she may have been Jewish. You had some that practiced traditional religions of the Amazigh, of the Berbers. So they weren't united by a particular ideology. The only thing that united them is they didn't want to be conquered by somebody from the outside. That was the only uniting factor. And that only goes so far, as we'll see when we talk about what happens. So she's the leader. She is actually the daughter of one of the great leaders among the Amazigh. She alongside of a rebel leader, named Kusala, are kind of ruling, and then she replaces him. And around 690, she battles Hassan ibn Numan, who was the general that was sent by the Arabs who were in Egypt to conquer the West. So they first clash around 690 CE. And at the time that she's fighting, she's around 50 years old. So she's lived a long time. She has sons. She has the respect of the people of the Amazigh, and they're ready to follow her into battle. And she spanks them, just like the Nubians did. She spanks, and the first battles, the first confrontations, her and her forces are everything that the Arabs could ask for in terms of a match. They beat them and pushed them back into Egypt. When she does this, when she wins the first few battles, she takes a lot of Arab prisoners. And one of the prisoners that she takes, it ends up being a mistake. She should have killed him, but she didn't. So she puts him back, and I'm going kind of fast. One of the prisoners that she takes is a guy named, his name is escaping me right now, but he's an Arab soldier that she keeps captive. And she actually treats him relatively well. And some of the ancient sources say that there may have been a romantic thing. So you got this lady, and she's in charge, and she sees this captured Arab that she has taken as a prisoner of war, and she basically treats him really well, makes him part of her entourage. And while this is happening, he is able, through some type of mechanism, to get messages back to Egypt. And he starts telling the defeated Arabs about what's going on, and that there's starting to be some division among her troops and the people. And, if you ever want to come back, there might be a good time to come attack the Berbers. So he is sending out intelligence back to Egypt while she's, taking care of him and treating him like either a lover, or some sources say she treated him like a son. But in any event, his name was Khalid. I'm gonna double check that. I'll have that for you next week, but I'm pretty sure his name was Khalid. So she has this prisoner named Khalid. She's treating him well, but he's feeding intelligence back to the Arabs in Egypt. Eventually, the Arabs make another offensive. They come back into the region based off the intelligence that they get from Khalid, and she's still fighting them. She makes a fatal mistake. She decides, because she doesn't think that the Arabs are trying to conquer the region and to incorporate it into the Arab Empire. She thinks that they're going to be like the Romans, and they're coming to tax, and they're coming to steal agriculture and that type of thing. So what she tells the Berbers to do, what she tells the Amazigh to do, is to burn down their fields. If the Arabs don't have anything to eat, then they'll leave the region. They won't be able to take over. So destroy the fields. I'm going to do a slash and burn campaign. We're going to destroy everything. That way they can't eat, and they'll be forced to go back to Egypt. But the problem is, these people have worked hard on their fields, and, we're talking about North Africa. And aside from the area on the coast, there's not a whole lot of land to be messing around with. You start to get to the Sahara Desert really quickly. So the people are like, well, if we burn down our fields, we're going to destroy our own livelihood, and it might take a minute for things to regrow, and I don't think we want to do that. So the fragile unity that existed among the Amazigh starts to break down after she makes this order to start destroying fields to slow down the Muslims. As a result of this, Muslims start winning victory after victory. The Arabs start winning victory after victory, and many of her troops actually desert to the Arabs. Eventually, she makes her last stand in an old arena that was built by the Romans somewhere around Tunisia, Algeria region. She makes her last stand before she's finally defeated by the Romans. I mean, the Arabs. The Arabs actually have respect that she went out like this, and her people actually respect her. In fact, up until the Algerian Revolution in the 20th century, the Amazigh remember her for her defiance of the Arabs and her desire to maintain Amazigh autonomy and independence. So she's a key independence figure. She's remembered that, Dahia al-Kahina, one of the key. We'll talk about her again in our Shiro's class, because she's one of the many African women that defended Africa from outside invasion. And if it wasn't for her adoption of Khalid and allowing him to live and him getting intelligence out, who knows how history would have changed. So before she dies, however, she tells her sons, look, don't lose your lives. Go over to the Arab side and join their military. Her sons along, and that's almost a metaphor for her other sons, or the men of the Amazigh. Many of them join the Arab army, and many of them convert to Islam. Again, the Arabs are saying, we don't really want a whole lot of people, even at this point, and we're getting to 700 CE, they're really saying, we don't want a whole lot of people to convert to Islam because we still want to tax you to maintain your own religion. So please don't convert. But a lot of them are like, I don't want to pay the tax. I'm going to convert to Islam, even if it's just nominally. Even if I just take the Shahada and never do anything else, I won't have to pay the tax. So many of the Amazigh join the military and they convert to Islam. So by the time the Arabs get into this light green part, many of the generals are Muslim, but most of the military, most of the people actually doing the fighting that are about to cross the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, most of them are North and Northwest Africans. And it is this group of people, led by the general, who's actually not Arab, he's actually Amazigh, General Tariq, conquered the Iberian Peninsula by the time we get to 711. And from 711 to 1492, we have an Arab African control over Spain and Portugal. Not the entire time, because toward that later end, the Portuguese get free from Moorish control, then eventually the Spanish get free in 1492 of Moorish control. But for that period of time, Africans and Arabs are running things in Europe. And now the world is incredibly connected. And as we'll get into when we get into part 2 of this class in February, we're going to see what happens when the world, and now through the Arab Empire, has become more connected all the way from China all the way into West Africa. The world is incredibly connected, and all these ideas start to spread. And you're going to see between the years of 1800, let's say 800 to 1500, you're going to see the crucial role that Africa plays in this early example of globalization, because Africa plays a central role in the kingdoms that emerge. Ghana, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, Ethiopia. We're going to talk about the Swahili city-states again. We're going to talk about the kingdom of Buganda. We're going to talk about the kingdom of Mauritania. We're going to talk about Morocco. We're going to talk about the importance of all of these African kingdoms that emerge and that are connected to this greater world story when we get to part 2 of this class. So stick with us. We'll get to that in February. And if you can't wait, and if you are interested in learning more about any of the things that we've talked about, here's the book that I recommend, if I have it up. And I've mentioned this a few times in class. History of Africa by Kevin Shillington. This is the text to get. Right now, with this class, I've only gone up to chapter 5 of this book, and this book has about 32 chapters, and I've just touched up to chapter 5. This book has a lot of pictures and maps, and it's a great resource to have in your home to get a general understanding of African history. If you're interested in something in particular that we've talked about over the past 8 weeks, go into the course website. We have readings, we have videos, we have articles dealing more in depth with the ideas that we brought up. And if there's something that happened during this time period that we didn't talk about, you can always shoot us an email to let us know that you want this covered in the next time we do this, because we will have this class again starting next July, this particular course. So we'll stop there today. I just, again, want to announce that starting next week, we will be having our seminar going over the life of Paul Robeson. I've mentioned him in passing a number of times in previous classes over previous years, and every time I mention him, I say, we got to do an entire class on Paul Robeson, and we're finally going to have that. You're going to learn about his life. I'm going to say things about Paul Robeson, and many of you who might never have heard of Paul Robeson or only heard about Paul Robeson in one aspect of his life, you might not even believe the things that I say about this man, because he was somebody that God blessed to be so good at so many things. So the precursor, when I talk about Paul Robeson, when I'm introducing him to young people or anybody that doesn't know Paul Robeson, I say, imagine if Denzel Washington, LeBron James, who's the best singer right now in the world? I have an old school mentality, so I would say Luther Vandross, whoever the best male singer is, whoever the best male athlete is, whoever the best male actor is, whoever the best male lawyer is, whoever the best male activist is, all of that put together in one person. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't mediocre at these things. He was the best at all of these things in this one man. But the most important aspect of that is his activism. Because with all the talent that he had, he could have completely turned his back on black folks, on working class people, on those that are seeking freedom, and just made fame and fortune his only goals. But that's not who this man was. And we're going to talk about his life over 4 weeks, and we're going to talk about all the things that he accomplished, but more importantly, the fact that he did this with the mind of an activist and with the soul of someone that really cared about the progression not only of African people and people of the African race, as he would call them, but also working class people around the world. So we're going to spend 4 weeks talking about Paul Robeson. So the link for that was in the initial class posting that I put out in July, but I will send it out again. Please tell people about this course. It'll be available like all of our stuff on YouTube, but we would love to have people come and engage in the live class to hear about Paul Robeson's life and to share this information. So use the course websites, read up on it. If you have any questions, you always feel free to email me. But if you have any pressing questions now or comments or announcements that you'd like to make, we'll now open it up for that. So I want to thank you all for listening, and yeah, we'll open it up for any discussion. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Daniel, anything in the chat?
Yes, there is one question. So, someone asked, were the terms of the treaty strictly reinforced? Is there any evidence that any of the everyday Nubian people became frustrated with any of the terms? The terms seem like a lot, but I don't have visibility on how treaties are typically written. So,
you can take it.
I'm sorry. Okay, so if I was to answer that, I would say that there's little evidence that this treaty was strictly reinforced, in the sense that a lot of Arab writers frequently talk about the Nubians breaking their treaty, which implies that there was no really cohesive way of enforcing that. At the same time, I would say that it had to be reinforced to some degree, because you can't just keep a treaty for 6 centuries without there being some sort of reinforcement. So I would say that it was half and half.
I would agree with Daniel's assessment. I would also add this, that the Nubians were strong enough to resist the Arabs. So even if they broke the treaty, it wasn't like the Arabs